Japan has this concept of Satoyama, where the forest sort of meets agriculture. Somehow ended up living in Ishikawa because for me it's like a perfect place to live. It's just beautiful. It's like a different world because the coastline has these really dramatic cliffs, sea urchin and squid swimming around.
Welcome to Unpacking Japan. I'm Toby and sitting here today with Casey.
Hello.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Casey, people know you online from your podcast,
Yes,
The Beanpod.
The Beanpod.
Your students know you as their teacher at the university.
That is true.
And many more people know you because you've been in Japan for a long time and done a lot of interesting things from teaching to gardening and permaculture, releasing and recording your own music albums.
Yep.
And your podcast.
Yes.
So let's dive a little bit into all of this and let's start maybe with what brought you to Japan in the first place.
Okay. I am the cliched white guy who fell in love with a Japanese woman and came to Japan to teach English. But it's a little more interesting than that, I hope. I guess to go way back, after I graduated college, I really wanted to live abroad. And I didn't have any destination in mind, but I figured if I teach English, I can do that basically anywhere. But I didn't know how to teach. I knew nothing about teaching, so I went to graduate school for a master's degree in teaching English as a second language. And while I was there, I met my future wife. And so we were dating for a few years and then we graduated and, my decision where to go had been made. So she came back home and a few months later I moved to Japan. I didn't have a job or anything lined up. I knew no Japanese. I was basically just going to stay with my girlfriend. And so I came over and I was looking for jobs and I had this fresh master's degree, no experience, but very high expectations. And so I was looking and applying for jobs at high schools and universities. I wanted to work in a university and I was just getting shot down left and right. And there were so many conversation school jobs, but I was, too good for those.
Eikaiwa.
Yeah. But it got to the point where I was running out of money. We were staying with our friends in their apartment.
In Tokyo?
Yeah, in Tokyo. And it got to the point where I was like, I'll take any job that will, provide an apartment for me. And so I ended up moving to Satoyama Prefecture and working at an English conversation school for about 2 years. And then I was able to move into university teaching after that.
There's a big difference in Japan when we talk about teaching at eikaiwa, which is usually focused a lot on children, but also there are adult classes, but they're like kind of small private schools. And a lot of teachers working there usually come from these dispatch companies, which can be criticized a lot in the news regularly for their business practices. Right. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have teaching at universities, which is what you're doing now. Yes. But you have experience doing both.
Yeah.
How was it to make the transition? Is it something easy? Now I feel like a lot of people say it's much more difficult to find university jobs than it used to be.
It has gotten really competitive. There are a lot of well-qualified English teachers in Japan now. When I did it back in 2006, it wasn't nearly as competitive compared to now. But I guess the biggest sort of challenge for me was at the conversation school, the students were really motivated. Even if they were lower level, they were paying money to take English classes. So they had this sort of inherent motivation. And when I moved to the university, it was just students who were taking required English classes and their level was amazingly low and their motivation was also quite low. So I had to work a lot harder to plan lessons that engaged the students and, were fun for them, but also educational for them.
So in a way, initially you did want to go to universities, but it wasn't as rosy as you
that's
kind of
true.
expected at the beginning.
Yeah, it was much better than the eikaiwa. But that job for me, the conversation school job, was perfect because for 2 years, I got all sorts of experience. Like I taught the whole spectrum of students from like tiny kids to really old people, and very beginners to really advanced speakers, and the students had different purposes for why they were studying. So as I said, I couldn't get a university job at first because I had no experience, but in that 2 years I just got, and you're teaching like 10 lessons a day or something, so some insane number of classes. So it was a good job for me at the time.
I'm quite curious because you actually studied a master's degree in teaching English as a second language. So I'm assuming you kind of had lessons on specific methodology of how to teach English, but this was maybe not necessarily applied to a Japanese context. So when you arrived here in Japan to teach Japanese people English, were there things that really surprised you in how English was being taught here, where you're like, this methodology is strange or unique, or?
Not really, because I've basically been working with foreigners, as colleagues for the whole time, and I haven't had to deal with like a high school or junior high school curriculum, which are more standardized and generally taught by Japanese teachers, a lot of the time in Japanese. But in the university setting, we have a little bit more flexible syllabus that we work with. So, and again, I'm still working with a lot of foreign teachers. So it's quite an international approach, at least where I work.
So you're now in Ishikawa Prefecture.
Yes.
Prefecture where there was a big earthquake on the 1st of January.
Yes.
Is this something you kind of had an impact on you at all, or were you like far away enough?
Yeah, it was really strong where I live. I live about, Kanazawa is the big city in Ishikawa, and the earthquake was up in the Noto Peninsula. And I live about 30 minutes south of Kanazawa. So we were quite far away. But it was still really, really strong at our house. Definitely the strongest earthquake I've ever experienced in Japan. But we didn't have any damage at our house or, to the neighborhood around us or the roads. Everything was totally fine. But I was surprised. I drove about 20 minutes further south, so even further away from the epicenter of the earthquake. And down there, I don't know, the soil consistency or whatever is maybe more similar to Noto because the roads were all cracked and the telephone poles were crooked and a lot of buildings had damage. So I guess we were lucky where we live, which is strange because there are people quite close by who've lost everything, material and family members. And it's kind of not guilty is not the right word, but it's just a strange situation to be in that close of proximity.
Having one house on one piece of land still standing and the next one kind of crumbled together. Yeah. And so Ishikawa is this prefecture where you've now settled for a long time, and you've been teaching at the university there. You said when you moved there, it was initially difficult to get students engaged because they just have to take a compulsory class. Right. How is it now? Do you feel like there's been a change in the last kind of decade that you've been teaching there? Or?
I mean, they're all sort of Japanese, they have some similar traits, at least at my school. One is and I work at an engineering college, so it's not like a liberal arts school where the students are naturally just more socially engaging. A lot of my students like machines. They don't like people so much. So I guess that's probably something that's a little unique at my school. And so it's basically the same. There's still the same level of effort that I need to make to appeal to these students and get them to sort of participate in class. But they're not too bad.
Have you found something that gets students engaged where you're like, oh, this really works?
It's just my handsome good looks and amazing personality. But no, just a lot of like group work. They're more comfortable when you put them together and not shining a spotlight on them and making them speak in front of the class. Definitely creating materials that are appropriate for their level, and we say scaffolding, like providing them with enough kind of support language to understand the things they don't know with the language. So yeah, and I do some podcasting with students and try to do the things that I'm passionate about, and then they can see that and hopefully enjoy it, doing it themselves.
Yeah, because even if they're not interested in people and the language, English is a international language by default now, and especially in engineering, you might need to collaborate with engineers from other countries on any kind of project. So I would assume that they also have a big need, and maybe for their career it's interesting.
Yeah.
Now, looking back, have you considered ever going back to eikaiwa, comparing both, or do you feel like
no,
university is
I'm never going back.
Never going back?
Yeah. I don't see any. If there was any scenario where I had to do that, I think I would just start my own. I don't want to work for another eikaiwa that's owned by another person. But I think I'll finish my career at university.
Yeah, it's a relatively nice environment.
Yeah.
But teaching is not all you do.
That's right.
You kind of started a lot of projects outside as well, and let's start maybe with one that you're quite known for, which is your podcast and your music.
Yes.
How did this get started?
So I really like podcasts. I like listening to podcasts, and at some point, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I thought, I started making it's connected to the university, but I started making an English podcast at the university that I would use and have students listen to. And I was interviewing teachers and students, and if we had students from overseas coming over to study Japanese, I would interview them. And I was really enjoying that. And then I thought, I want to make, a non-work podcast. And so I had a friend, I still have a friend, and we started a podcast called Gozaimasu. And it was just the two of us. We made that for a year or two, and then he lost interest. But I needed to fill the podcast void in my life, so I just started the Beanpod at that time.
So for people that maybe have not listened and are hearing about the Beanpod for the first time, can you maybe introduce a little bit what you do on this podcast? Yeah,
it's very mundane, and people seem to like it for some reason. I usually play a song on my guitar, my acoustic guitar, and it started, I was playing cover songs, and then I started writing my own music. So most of the songs recently are my original songs. So we start out with a song. I used to play the song at the end, but the people suggested I move it to the front, and so I did that. So now I usually start off with a song, and then I just talk about anything that's happened of note in my life since the last episode. I give a garden update. I talk about the weather. Frequently talk about my children because they're a source of entertainment in my life. And if there are any relevant current events that affect me, I might, talk about those a bit, but it's kind of like an audio diary. And I don't know why people like it, but
it's actually quite interesting, right? Because a lot of people living in Japan or outside have maybe preconceptions about what it's like, and then we go on YouTube to find information about Japan, and we see a lot of content creators showing you the best places to go, or some really cool restaurant, and some nice apartments that you can maybe rent, but not so many show or share what is a daily life in Japan, to live with your family in a house in the countryside. Do you think that's maybe exactly the thing that people are looking for?
I guess it could be. It makes sense when you say it. So, yeah.
It creates a sort of community too. Right? Maybe I imagine a lot of your listeners are in Japan maybe, and just what are other people's experiences?
Right.
Do Do you notice any specific interests for, I mean, you live in Ishikawa, which is maybe a prefecture with less foreigners, something that's people are specifically interested in or unique to Ishikawa that you get to experience in?
On the podcast or in
just general? In general, but that you share maybe occasionally?
I share a lot of love and gratitude for the fact that I somehow ended up living in Ishikawa, because for me, it's like a perfect place to live. It's just beautiful. It's close to the ocean, and I grew up near the ocean, and I love, going to the beach during the summer. I went to school in Vermont, which is a very mountainous, beautiful state.
Northeast of the United States, yes. For non-American listeners.
Thank you. And so, and I have the best of both worlds in Ishikawa. And so I think just the life there is a unique experience, because you have just spoiled with beauty. We have Kanazawa, which is a historic city with amazing restaurants and historical sites, and it's just a fantastic place to live. And I try to promote that on my podcast and on my Twitter feed. There are lots of pictures of beautiful Ishikawa. So
if I were to take a train tomorrow to Ishikawa, where should I stop first?
Kanazawa Station. And then I would say rent a car and just drive out, because within 20 minutes you can be in just beautiful rice paddies and mountains. But downtown Kanazawa is just a nice place to walk around and just take in the old architecture and the food. And then if you have more ability to move around, if you do have a car, I love the Kaga area, which is the southern part of Ishikawa Prefecture. It's like a different world, because the coastline has these really dramatic cliffs, and just if you swim there in the summer, it has sea urchin and squid swimming around. And the beach where I live is just like a normal sandy beach that you can just walk down and jump in the water. But this one, it's cliffs. You have to walk down paths to get down to the beach, and it's like a secluded jungle beach. So I love that area. There's another small town called Yamanaka Onsen, which is down there, which is a really cool onsen town that has a big ravine with a river running at the bottom of it, and there are the onsen hotels come right up to the river. You're sitting in the outdoor bath.
That sounds like the typical picture you'd see with the momiji in fall.
It's really Spirited Away, like the movie.
One thing you just said was you should stop first at Kanazawa Station and then rent a car and go out.
Yes.
Now, you've initially lived in Tokyo.
Yes.
So this is a very dense place with very convenient public transport. Public transport is still relatively convenient in rural Japan, especially compared to the United States, I would say.
Yeah.
But it's still quite a challenge. How was the adaptation for you to move to such a very beautiful place, but maybe more difficult to get around if you don't have a car?
Yeah, well, initially I lived closer to Kanazawa, so there is a small 2-car train that runs not quite down to Kanazawa. It's kind of inconvenient, but basically you have to rely on buses, more than anything. But we my wife and I got a car relatively shortly after moving there, because it became apparent, and the weather's not good a lot of the time, especially in winter.
Isn't it the region of Japan with the most rainfall per year?
I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised. It's a dark place a lot of the time, but I like that. The weather is always blowing in off the ocean, and it's very dramatic and always changing. So I know a lot of people suffer from seasonal affective disorder in the winter, but for me, I enjoy it. But yeah, so to go back to your question, I got my driver's license as soon as I possibly could once we moved there, and it makes a huge difference.
Would you say it's possible to live comfortably in the countryside of Japan without a car?
I mean, if I were living where I live now and didn't have a car, it would be tough because the buses are few and far between. And then, you're riding a bus everywhere. So you really need to like plan out how you're going to go wherever you're going, because you can't just decide like, let's go, to the mall.
No, you really need the kind of your own transportation.
Right.
You described Ishikawa as like a very picturesque place, and you share this a lot in the photos, in this changing weather that you were just talking about. And you also share music. You said you recently started to write your own songs and release albums.
Yes.
How did that get started?
I've been playing the guitar for more than 20 years, and I've always like wanted to write music. I had a period probably 15 years ago where I wrote maybe half a dozen songs. I bought a new guitar. At that time, it was like my first nice guitar. And that sort of inspired me to write music. And then I sort of got away from it. So for at least a decade, I've been in the back of my mind, like, you got to start writing music. And I don't know, something just clicked, and I started writing and being more proactive about it. Like, okay, I'm gonna be constantly looking around for inspiration for lyrics, and sort of switching my mindset to that and viewing the world a little differently was a big step. And then sitting down to actually write, even if I just as a habit, like every evening I'm gonna sit down for 20 minutes and just write, even if it's garbage or if it never becomes a song. I need to have discipline about this, if I want to actually do it.
And creation takes discipline, right? It's not just inspiration.
Yeah, for sure.
To put in the work.
Yeah, and I'm not that disciplined. So,
well, you've been consistently releasing your podcast, and now
I guess
a few albums already that you put together by yourself. And you said that the last big thing you share after your music and your daily updates about life in Ishikawa is your garden.
Yes.
And so I want to talk about your garden because it's a big part of your life now. And you work especially on permaculture, if I understand that correctly.
Yeah.
So the act of kind of permanent cultivation, right? As it was originally put together at the word.
Right.
And sustainable gardening. Basically. Can you explain a little bit what you do with your garden?
So basically, I have a forest garden or food forest. And the premise behind this, there are a few sort of core principles to forest gardening. And one of those is, basically you're trying to create a garden that is like not fully mature. Like if you like imagine the Japanese forest, it's all probably 99% cedar trees. And there's not much happening down below the canopy because the sunlight's all blocked out. So we're looking for the young forest conditions, which is the most sort of biodiverse stage of growth in progression from basically having nothing to having a mature forest. A young forest has the most species of plants and species of animals living in it. So it's a very dynamic and robust system that it's a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Resilient condition.
So by young forest, you mean it's forest where the trees haven't fully grown out?
Well, some of them have. So there are so one of the main concepts of a forest garden is layers, and meaning layers of vegetation. And there are 7 layers. So you have your canopy trees, or the tallest, and those might be fully mature. And then you have a kind of sub-canopy. So in my garden, I have like a black locust tree, which is probably 15 meters tall.
Wow.
It's big. I have another tree that's a Japanese alder, which is also about the same size. So that's the canopy layer. And then down below that is the sub-canopy, and I have things like apple trees and pear trees and trees that aren't as tall. as the canopy layer. And then from that, you go down to shrubs, which like blueberry bushes and things like that, blackberries. And then you go down to, where are we at, 4 now? Herbaceous perennials, which are things like rosemary, or things that rosemary doesn't die out in the winter, but plants that will die back in the winter, but they're perennial, so they come back in the fall, like herbs and things like that. And then you have ground cover, a ground cover layer. So in my garden, I have a lot of white clover, and I'll explain why I chose these plants in a minute. And then you have underground layer. So like in a vegetable garden, this would be things like potatoes, but in a forest garden, it's things like Jerusalem artichokes, ginger, things like that are more perennial. I don't know if ginger's perennial or not, but so things growing underground. And then you have a vining layer, so like kiwi and grapes and things like that. So you've got stuff happening at all levels. If you had a mature forest where it's all the sunlight's blocked out, you couldn't grow all of those sub-layers because there wouldn't be any sun.
So that's a super complex system in a way that kind of works together.
Yes.
How did you get into that in the first place?
So my wife and I built a house about 10 years ago, and when we were looking for land, I wanted to live like way out in the sticks. Like that would be totally fine with me, but she's from rural Japan, and she's already sort of escaped from that lifestyle once and did not want to go back. So we were looking at more, or I guess less rural places. But for me, one of the main criteria was that it had enough land for me to have a big garden, because I'd recently gotten into just vegetable gardening. And so we moved in, and I had this big, huge garden, and I was growing all sorts of vegetables the first summer. And then the winter came, and there was like nothing. There's just dirt in my yard. And I thought, like, it's ugly for one thing, and it's kind of like not interesting either. It's not as I had envisioned this sort of super productive space that I was going to cultivate. And I started, there was another foreign guy he had a blog, and he was really into forest gardening. He was living in Aichi. And I started reading his blog, and it just looked like he had this amazing garden full of perennial plants that was always beautiful and productive. And I started interacting with him a bit, and then I read a few books about permaculture and forest garden design and just garden design in general. And then I started plotting this forest garden that I was gonna plant. And that was 6 or 7 years ago, I think. And now, like, I started with dirt, and now I have a yard full of, there's a 10-meter trees in my yard. And, during the summer, you can't see my house from the road, even though it's not that far set back. So it's been so interesting and fulfilling to see all these like concepts that I read about, to see them actually come true.
So this is really something you built from scratch.
Yeah.
It's not something where you're like, I'll take one of this, and just put here, and it's gonna be fine. It's something you had just the land, and you decided to plant specific plants in specific locations to kind of match those concepts.
Yes.
Right. So you explained that a forest garden has these 7 layers of plants that kind of work in symbiosis. What are some other concepts that you kind of applied to your garden? Yeah,
the big one is plant functions. I basically don't plant anything just because when I say plant functions, some of those, a primary one is it produces food, because this is a food forest. It could be a nutrient accumulator. We say dynamic accumulators. So nitrogen is a big one. And so it's a plant that sort of sucks nitrogen out of the soil. And what are the other ones? Like potassium and phosphorus, I think, are the 3. If you buy a bag of fertilizer at the home center, those are the 3 nutrients that it has in it that are important for plants to grow and produce fruit. So planting things that, they suck these minerals from deep down in the soil, it accumulates in their leaves, and in the winter when the plant dies back, those nutrients go back into the surface of the soil and are accessible by the other plants around it that need it. So you're doing this sort of soil improvement always, naturally. Other functions, to attract pollinating insects like bees and butterflies. This one hasn't worked for me, but another function is to deter sort of pests.
Okay.
Haven't found a magic bullet for that because many of the things in my garden get decimated by insects in the summer. But those are things like mint and things that are very strong smelling are supposed to keep, the beetles and things away, but I'm not sure the validity of that one. Other things are like to provide habitat for beneficial animals, or lizards, or whatever's creeping around in your garden. So yeah, plant function is a huge
So that's a big concept.
Yeah.
I'm quite curious because you're doing this in Japan, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Can you grow anything you want in Japan, especially with the climate in Ishikawa? You said it changes a lot. It has a lot of rainfall. In winter, you're also in relatively close proximity to Japanese Alps, and you can maybe get quite a heavy snowfall.
Yeah.
How does it work? Can you plant anything you want?
I've had pretty good success planting everything that I want to. We just have to sort of prepare, especially in winter. We get really heavy snow. I'm heavy in the sense that it weighs a lot. It's got a lot of water in it because it's coming right off the ocean, and we're not that cold where I live. So like this winter, I took some damage on a lot of my trees with branches broken and things like that. So, but if you prepare for it, tie things up in the fall before the snow, that's not a huge concern. Recently, it's just been so hot in the summer that worries me more than the winter, because I don't want to be constantly watering. Part of the sort of goal of creating a forest garden is that it's self-maintaining. Once you get it established, you hopefully shouldn't have to be doing much weeding because the ground cover crops are going to kill out the weeds. You shouldn't need to overwater because, not so much sunlight is getting down to the floor of the forest. But, and I just feel like it's wasteful to just stand out with a hose for 30 minutes soaking my garden.
But recently, the last few years, it has gotten very, very hot and for a very, very prolonged period of time.
Yeah.
So I can imagine that's difficult.
Yeah.
You were saying earlier that you chose your ground covering crops for a very specific reason.
Yeah.
Was this to keep the weeds out, or was it something else as you?
Yeah. So if we think about those functions again, like I put white clover in all of the pathways. And another thing is when you're planting something, sorry, I get passionate about the garden. You want to you don't want to plant something that only has one function. As much as you can, you want as many functions as possible. So like white clover is great because it fixes nitrogen, as I mentioned before. So it's sucking nitrogen out of the soil and providing it to the other plants around it. It is very tolerant to foot traffic, so you can walk all over it and it's fine. It doesn't die. When it flowers, it attracts loads of bees, and a lot of other animals use it as shelter. They live down in the roots and among the leaves. So it's just a great plant. Probably my favorite plant is white clover. So love that one. And then another great ground cover is wild strawberry. Are you familiar with wild strawberry?
No.
It's
I can imagine what it is, but I don't think I've...
It looks like, the leaves look like normal strawberry leaves, but the fruit is quite small, but it's very prolific. It creeps out everywhere, and the good thing about it is it produces fruit basically all summer, unless it gets too hot. But normal strawberries you might get harvest, 1 or 2 times, but these are constantly producing. And again, perennial, so they come back every spring.
So it's a real ecosystem where everything is dependent on the other in a way to kind of work and grow and self-sustain over the years.
Yeah.
That's a quite interesting concept.
Yeah, it's really cool. I'm still, in the process of establishing my garden and trying to get these processes to happen like reliably.
What got you into this? You were saying that you saw another foreigner doing this in Aichi Prefecture.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, is this also something you've seen done by Japanese people? Is this a concept that is internationally used, or is this kind of a specific gardening concept that was coined somewhere and not so popular in Japan yet?
I think the guy who coined like the idea permaculture is from Australia.
Bill Hawlins.
Yeah.
Something like, I forgot the exact name.
Something like that. But I think there's some, Japan has this concept of Satoyama. I don't know if any of your previous guests have spoken about that.
It's the first time we talk about Satoyama.
Yeah, I don't know much about it, but it's a very similar concept to, having a integrated system for food production. It means where the forest sort of meets agriculture, and there's a lot of crossover. I'm probably going to sound like an idiot talking about this, but they maintain the forest sort of strategically so that it doesn't become fully mature, so that other species can grow. And then the rice paddies are sort of an ecosystem of their own that have a lot of wildlife coming into it. And it's a really interesting concept that I can't speak at length, but it's very similar. There's a lot of overlap between forest gardening and this sort of concept of Satoyama, which has existed, I guess, forever in Japan. So the concept has existed here. So
because it's quite interesting in Japan, especially recently, if we talk a little bit about sustainability, there's been a big push for these SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, that we see usually more in corporate environments, but the actual work is to basically what you're doing, for example, on a small scale with your forest garden. And we recently had John on the show who does urban farming. Right? So he does farming on rooftops, balconies, everywhere where you can do something in the city, in an urban setting. He will do that. You do it in the countryside and so, but do you feel like this could play a bigger role into discussions? For example, I'm thinking you work at an engineering school, higher education. Gardening is not engineering, but there could be some engineering into how can we
I actually have planted a forest garden at my school.
Wow.
So I've sort of, one of the things I'm really thankful for is that I've been able to pursue my own passions through work. And that's one, podcasting is one and gardening is another. So I've got a project that brings students in and teaches them about this concept of forest gardening, but also just how to grow vegetables and how to maintain a garden. And
I'm quite curious now, because if you bring this into a university and you interact with students on this project, how is their understanding and approach? Do you feel like there's an interest? Is it curiosity, or is it again something they just have to do for the credits?
No, this is a totally voluntary thing. So they're interested in gardening, and I try not to get too high concept with them. Like for most of them, they've never grown, a tomato before. So for them, it's so interesting and exciting to like plant a tomato seedling, and a few weeks later, you're harvesting and eating a tomato that you grew. Like I remember the first time I did that, and it's just like so cool.
This is my tomato.
I made this. Yeah, I didn't have to buy it. I forget how that started, but what was your question?
About how the students kind of interact with this, and if this is a concept that you see them interested in learning more about and kind of pushing further.
Yeah. I think they're interested in it, but they're busy. So I just, if I can plant this seed in their mind, the seed of interest, and it's something they take with them, going forward in their life, then that's enough. And then once in a while, I might get one student who's really into it, and then I can sort of go deeper and nerd out about gardens with that kind of student.
For you, it's been a long-term project. You said you really started this 7 years ago.
Yeah.
If someone listening to this is like, oh, this sounds really cool, I want to get started. Is this something that can be done or started soon, or is it something that needs to be planned for, like, okay, I need to kind of commit to making my first garden over the next 10 years, otherwise I'm not going to see anything?
I would get as thorough a plan as you can, because but it's hard if you don't know, in the beginning, because I planted a bunch of stuff, and then a few years later I was like, why did I put that there? Or I wish I'd done something else. And you can always dig things up and move them around for a few years, but that sort of sets back the maturity of the plant, and it's not great for it, but it's not going to die. But I would say design a guild, which is another concept of forest gardening, which is just a group of plants that you want to grow and interact with. So like the way I have 3 or 4 guilds in my garden, and I like to put like a nitrogen fixing tree in the middle. And then around that, I'll plant a couple fruit trees or maybe a blueberry bush. And so hopefully those are feeding off the nitrogen. And then around those, I'll plant some other dynamic accumulator plants that will absorb other minerals from the soil and then put them back for the other plants. And then a ground cover that will, do whatever function it is that I want it to do. And maybe practice with those, just designing guilds. And what plants first of all, what do you want from your garden? Do you want food, or is this something you just want to focus on attracting wildlife to your garden? Or figure out your purpose is the first task. And then I would play around with designing guilds and, just get some ideas, and then things sort of become clearer. It depends on what your space is like too. How much sun do you get?
It sounds to me like doing a forest garden, because it's supposed to be somewhat self-sustaining, it's less about the daily work of watering them and maintenance and removing weeds, because they're not supposed to be too many, but more about you need to plan and design an ecosystem of plants and vegetables. And so it's more like a lot of preparation beforehand.
Right.
Do you have like a daily routine that you need to go through, or is this really something where you just enjoy your garden and then occasionally you need to kind of check through?
Yeah, I mean, weeds are still an issue. So that's like the main task that I do in my garden at this point is weeding. I don't really have room to put anything else in my garden at this point. So I don't, and that's something I'll do like maybe once a month. So it's basically pretty self-sufficient right now.
Is this something that led you to also kind of connect with other people doing this, maybe specifically in Japan? I know you've talked to JJ Walsh, who was sitting in your chair a few months ago, and kind of shared your passion for permaculture and forest gardening. But do you notice that there's a community of people across Japan, maybe spread out, but kind of interested in developing forest gardening?
Yeah, I think a few people are interested in it, but I don't know if there's much of a like real community developed yet. There are a few people online that are very passionate about gardening that I communicate with regularly. So I guess that's a community.
Yeah,
a small one.
A lot of things are moving online, but it makes it convenient, right? Because you live in your corner of Japan in Ishikawa, and the person that inspired you to get started is on the other side. In Aichi,
I don't know where he is these days. He kind of went off the reservation.
But online is a place that kind of connects.
Yeah, we send seeds to each other, and so yeah, it is a small but passionate community of gardeners.
So looking forward now into the future, you say it's still a work in progress. What are the next steps for you to develop your garden? Are there still things to add, to optimize, to design, or is this something that is just kind of developing on its own now?
I think I'm at the point where it's developing on its own. I really want a water feature, like a pond, but it's a big point of contention with my wife. She's worried about mosquitoes. There are ways to prevent that, but it's not worth the conflict. So I think I'm content with where it is, and I want to just let it run for a few years and see what needs to be done after that.
It really is a long-term project. Right? It's not something where anyone can expect overnight results or next year results.
No, not at all.
But it's pretty cool that you've been committed to developing this, and hearing you talk about this with so much passion is inspiring too. I don't have a garden and won't have a garden because I live in a city, which makes it more difficult.
Yeah, for sure.
That's probably one of the big advantages of living in a countryside and having more space.
Yeah.
Looking back now at your time in Japan, you arrived in Tokyo with your wife with no plan, nothing lined up, had a dream of working at university, which didn't end up happening at first. You went to Eikaiwa and then you moved to Ishikawa. And do you feel like, looking back, a lot of things have changed? Have you kind of found your place here in Japan?
I think I have. I've built a life here, which I'm quite proud of, that I came over. Couldn't speak any Japanese, didn't have a job. And, 20 years later, I built a nice house and have a stable job and a lovely family and things I'm passionate about. And I've worked very hard, but I've also been very lucky as well. So I'm, very grateful for that, the way things have worked out.
For anyone listening that is struggling to find a foothold here in Japan or considering a move, what kind of advice would you like to share with them about adapting to life or making a life here?
Yeah. I mean, the obvious one is learn Japanese, because as we were talking earlier before we started recording, if you can communicate, a whole new world of opportunities opens up to you. And not just job opportunities, but opportunities to meet people and form relationships. I think a big challenge for people that move here is feeling lonely or isolated. And a lot of that, or for many people, it's because they can't communicate. So obviously that's a lonely existence. So that's just a basic thing, is learn the language, put effort into it, either before you come or especially once you come. And a thing that really changed my experience here was getting more involved in the community. When my wife and I moved out of an apartment and into a neighborhood, we started making friends and barbecuing with our neighbors. And, you grow attached to these people and you see them every day, and form real bonds and real friendships and real relationships. And then after we moved into the house that we built, I started getting involved in the community more, going to neighborhood meetings. And, I'm an immigration ambassador for my town.
Wow.
So I go to the city hall and, meet the mayor and meet other people who are also immigration ambassadors. And, I feel like I'm involved, which is fulfilling. I'm not just I don't just live here. I'm a member of the community. And that's a huge thing, I think, that not everybody experiences, but you can, go down to the city hall and just see what civic things you can become involved in.
Well, we often hear the debate online, living in Japan versus living on Japan, right?
Yeah.
And so you definitely fall into the category of living in.
I think so.
But I'm quite curious because we also read a lot or hear stories or talk to people that express the challenges of joining a community. We have both sides, right? Sometimes people move into a neighborhood and they're super welcome and people are very happy to have them there and curious and open. And others where they feel like they're not welcome at all and they feel rejected from joining. How was the process for you to become this ambassador? Is it something that happened naturally or did you?
Yeah, I think, how did it happen? I can't remember. It was a few years ago. But somebody from the town hall asked me, and I agreed. Sorry, that's a horrible answer. I can't remember clearly.
But it started from connecting with neighbors, going to like city or neighborhood events. And such.
And I think like where I live, there aren't that many foreign residents. So, and I think, I mean, there is some appeal to like having a foreign person among your immigration ambassadors, and they want to attract more foreign people. So, you know, pick the foreign guy, and you know, that's fine with me.
What are some of the kind of things they ask you to help with and assist in
the main one that I've participated in, I started right as the pandemic was kicking off. So that instantly limited the options of things that we could do to like sort of engage with people. But I've done a handful of online seminars where it might be an Ishikawa initiative, and there'll be like 3 people from different parts of Ishikawa, and it's like anybody can join this online seminar, and it's like a PowerPoint. I have a bunch of my pictures and talk about, you know, how much I like the living there and what the good points are, and reassure everybody that there's not that much snow. And so it's just that sort of activity so far. They want to start an Instagram account where all the ambassadors contribute pictures like throughout the year to, you know, show the different seasons.
It's quite interesting because we see this push from the Japanese government to get people to leave the major cities, especially Tokyo, and settle more into the countryside. And then you see initiatives like your town trying to attract people, maybe especially attract foreigners. But the things they ask are related to, it's a nice place to live. We don't have too much snow. Don't be scared to come. It's fine. Do you feel like there's like sometimes the misconceptions about what makes it attractive to actually live there, as opposed to what they are trying to push and advertise?
I don't know. I think it's pretty, like, because a lot of the people they're trying to attract are coming from cities. And like one of the image they have of Ishikawa, Kanazawa is like they have the image of Kenroku-en and covered in snow in their head. So maybe they've never driven in the snow. Maybe they don't even have a car. So they're like legitimate concerns that they want to, you know, hear the real experience about from people who live there. But yeah, I think it's pretty well aligned. I never feel like I'm selling a false narrative when I do it.
Because when I asked you if I take a train ticket tomorrow to Kanazawa, you highlighted all the good stuff. You didn't necessarily highlight, don't worry about this, it's fine. You kind of were like, this is awesome, this is awesome, this is awesome. Come and visit us. Sounds like a more attractive message than, don't worry, you can get around. I've seen this before in other prefectures as well, where they are trying to attract people with, from my perspective, living in the city, I'm like, I would love to live in the countryside, but what you're advertising is not necessarily what I need. Right. Such as a stable job or you know, infrastructure that provides for families, school, education, hospitals, which people from the city might be more worried about as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because before I do any of these online things, they work with like a PR company in Tokyo. And they send me like a list of questions, and like, you know, that's always on the question, like what's winter like, or like how cold is your house in the winter? And so it's clear they're trying to target the things that people who don't live there are concerned about. But it's interesting to hear what you say.
Yeah, the perspectives are a little bit different, right? Between what they advertise, what the PR agency says, and what the people are really concerned. But it's great to see that they also give you the opportunity to contribute to this and kind of give a foreign perspective as well to living in Ishikawa and sharing it today here with us.
Thank you.
We covered quite a few points, from you moving to Japan and getting into teaching at university, and we talked a bit about your podcast, your music, and your garden, which you're very passionate about. Is there something you feel like we didn't really get to talk about that we could talk about more?
I think we covered pretty much everything, yeah. There was one book I wanted to mention when we were talking about what you were asking about, whether this like forest gardening concept exists in Japan. And I think it's called the One Straw Revolution. And it's about a Japanese farmer who sort of pioneered the this sort of permaculture idea, and I can't remember who wrote the book, but search for it, One Straw Revolution, and it shows how a lot of these concepts have been used in Japan.
So the premise is kind of before the idea of permaculture, as it was kind of talked about in the West. Some Japanese farmers had an approach to farming which kind of already applied those concepts without giving them the names.
Yeah.
So this is one book that you'd recommend for people interested. Any other recommendations for someone who...
I really loved a book called Gaia's Garden by an author named Toby Hemingway. And that's a great book that's not forest garden so much centered, but it's a lot of permaculture, a lot of explaining how plants function and, just general garden design. Great introductory book if any of these ideas appeal to you. And then there's another book that was indispensable. It's called like The Forest Garden or something. And it's by author named Martin Crawford, I believe. And that's a really great book that just shows, it goes through the different layers, and it's just an appendix basically of plants and their functions and how big they get, what they need in terms of sunlight, how tolerant they are of shade. And it even lists like good varieties of those. So that's a very practical book that it's basically like a forest garden plant encyclopedia. And then the most sort of scientific book I read was called Edible Forest Gardens, which I can't remember the name of the author, but there's like book 1 and book 2. And I read the second book, which is primarily garden design, and that was like really amazing. And that's what I was reading as I was designing my forest garden. And it has if you want a garden that's growing in a shady spot, here's a design, and here are some plants that work well in those conditions. And then in the back, it's got like every plant you could imagine and all of the functions, and just really nerdy but really informative. So Edible Forest Gardens. So
for anyone interested, there are a lot of resources available out there for people to find information.
For sure. Yeah.
Any of those also available in Japanese? Did you see those books translated in bookstores in Japan?
No, I don't think they are.
So this is still kind of not, but maybe in a different way they will have other books to talk about Satoyama and other concepts.
Yeah.
So definitely it's a place to get started for people interested to learn more. And if people are interested to hear your upcoming album, or your last release was last year.
Yeah, I have a new batch of songs that I'm planning to record soon.
So we can expect your next album coming out this year, which is kind of like folk, country, rock.
Yeah, it's just me and my acoustic guitar. So it's folk is probably the best description of it, I would say.
So we'll link everything in the description.
Thank you.
And people can find you on Twitter, the Beanpod, and they will find...
Yeah, I'm at tbeanpod on Twitter. And if you search my name, Casey Bean, in like Spotify or Apple Music, or have a Bandcamp page where you can find my music. So please listen. I'd love it.
Thank you very much for coming, Casey.
Thanks for having me.
I'm certainly more interested in forest gardening, and definitely want to go back to Ishikawa for some holiday.
Please do.
I've been once in a winter visiting Korakuen, as you mentioned, cold and snow, and that was a great place to go. So for anyone who hasn't been.
Yes, everyone come to Ishikawa. It's a beautiful spot.
Thank you, Casey, for coming. Thank you, everyone, for listening and for watching us. This was Unpacking Japan, and we'll see you again next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.